And we got with us, Cliff has brought us in some guests, and he's brought in Lida and Deborah J, and I'm going to let him introduce them so that I can go away and watch this like everybody else. First of all, I'd like to apologize for last week when we had to cave technical difficulties, but we have all the people on the screen this week seem to have mastered the art to the point that they make me embarrassed to have ever worried. Um, so, Cliff, tell us what you're doing today.
So today, it being Pride Month, I decided I would have a Pride special. And I have two wonderful authors here. Lida Morehouse is also Tate Halloway. And Lida wrote, as Lida, wrote Archangel Protocol. Hold that up, Lida. There you go. First edition of Archangel Protocol. I have a lovely one in my house as well, which was a Seamus, is that how you say it? Seamus Award?
That is correct, yes.
And a Locus Award nominated book. And her most recent novel, Unjust Cause, was published by the wonderful small press Wizard Tower Press in England. And her who also be publishing her forthcoming book with the working title, Welcome to Boynet, the first volume of the Earth Shadow series, trilogy, I'm not sure which.
We'll see.
Series, because the first volume, I'm in her critique group, and the first volume is lovely, at least what I've read so far. Okay, and Deborah J. Ross is also an award-nominated writer and editor. Her work got an honorable mention, Year's Best SF. Her book, Collaborators, was nominated for the Lambda Award. Hold that up. Yep. Wonderful book.
Two covers.
Yeah, two covers. And we'll talk about that. Two different editions. And that first was Lethe Press, right? I want to say.
No, Dragon Moon.
Dragon Moon. Okay. That I misremembered. And she's got all these other nominations: Gaylactic Spectrum Award, National Fantasy Federation Speculative Fiction Award for Best Author, and she's been on the short list for the Otherwise Award, formerly the Tiptree, right? And her short fiction has appeared in F&SF, Asimov's Star Wars Tales from Jabba's Palace, which is probably my favorite, Realms of Fantasy, and the Sword and Sorceress series of books. She's edited the Lace and Blade series and many other anthologies, and has served as Secretary of SFWA, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, and chaired the jury for the Philip K. Dick Award, another prestigious award.
Oh, I did that too.
Oh, did you? Okay. Wow! See, you're fabulous. You're such fabulous people. And I'm so lucky to have you both here on the show. So this is a topic that we could spend, of course, many hours on. So what I would like to do sort of is, because you've both been writing for a while, and you've been reading for even longer, and as have I. And I'd like to talk about LGBTQIA plus, or quilt bag, or queer, whatever you want to say. I'll probably just say LGBTQ plus or LGBTQ because that rolls off the tongue so easily. But whatever initials you want to say in science fiction, fantasy, and horror literature. So my first question for my fabulous panel is, what was your first exposure as a reader to LGBTQ plus in SF and SF, and how did that make you feel?
I have a good one if it's okay for me to start.
You may start, Lida.
Okay, I have a good one because it also, I think, demonstrates the long history of queer writing in science fiction and fantasy. So my very first exposure to queer science fiction was so I did the thing that a lot of nerd kids do when I went to the library. I found the Star Wars books, and then the way my library had it worked out is that they then started anthologies, including like the Hugo and Nebula Award one. And I just was a kid, so I was like, okay, whatever the next book is on the shelf, I'll just keep going through the science fiction section.
Sure.
And in one of those books, I was exposed to a short story by Theodore Sturgeon that was written in 1953. Called World Well Lost. And I read this short story and I never imagined that there was a possibility that there could be not only a same-sex sort of love story in there, but that the aliens were so cool and also same-sex lovers that I was just blown away. I was just like, oh, hey, there's a possibility. And then probably my next one, the first time I saw lesbians in science fiction was again in the early 1970s when I read Elizabeth A. Lynn's series, The Dancers of Arun, I think it's pronounced. And then I read everything by Elizabeth A. Lynn. And that was the first time also I discovered that there was this thing called science fiction conventions, because when she was at WisCon, I talked my dad and my then boyfriend, I'm sorry, Ben, into going to WisCon just to see Elizabeth A. Lynn because I had a gigantic crush on her. So that's my story. I would love to hear that.
Fabulous.
Yeah, isn't it? But
This
I
is
always
amazing.
I
I haven't met you before, Lida, and my first exposure to quilt bag stuff was Theodore Sturgeon.
oh, yay!
It wasn't that story though. It was Venus Plus X.
Oh, yes, right. I have that in my
Came out
bathroom.
in 1960. And it really blew my mind that there was this planet of people who were not binary gendered.
Right.
And and blah 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 blah. But it really started me thinking about wow, this is a question that can be asked. This is something that I can consider. And then actually the next thing was Marion Zimmer Bradley's World Records, which came out in 1971. And on Darkover, she has a race called the Cherry, which are non-human, and they are gender fluid. And in the neutral state, androgynous. And she has a character that appears slightly androgynous male that then transitions to female. And I kept coming back to that because it's the relationship with a human male. He has to look at his own prejudices about this person, not this plumbing, but this person that he's fallen in love with. And what does it mean that the person appears male at first? Yeah. And how do you then stay in your heart as the person changes?
Right.
So that was, and then for me also, Elizabeth A. Lynn, it was A Different Light.
Oh, I loved A Different Light.
Yeah. I love that book.
One of the things I did to prepare for this was I emailed a bunch of my friends who are, they're not all queer, but they write queer stuff. Mm-hmm. And I asked, what was the most important book? My screen just went blank. Can you still see me?
I can see you.
Okay, great. The camera's still working. They told a lot of really interesting stories, and I hope I get to quote from them later about, especially people my age. I'm in my mid-70s. What was the book? And A Different Light came up again and again and again. And Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness. But A Different Light was just, it was a mind blower for so many gay kids.
Yeah, for real.
Sure.
I want to also say, before you go on, Cliff, that one of my other formative ones, was Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time for trans characters. Jackrabbit is still one of my favorite all-time characters, and it was the first time I was introduced to a neo-pronoun because she uses per for person, which I really liked. It was a really.
Why didn't that catch on? Because that's clever.
Per is really clever. I don't know why it catch on.
I've never seen that pronoun.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody uses it, but I would love to.
Yeah.
All
Oh,
right.
and the other name that came up again and again was Melissa Scott.
Oh, of course,
Mhm.
Melissa.
Folks,
Scott.
but Melissa Scott,
Yeah.
and and
Sure.
how early she was writing and how important her work was personally to people.
Sure.
I
So I
can see
had a completely different entry point into LGBTQ. So the first also from a school library, William. I don't know if it's Slater or Sleater because I never met him,
Oh yeah.
but he wrote like 5 million zillion books that we would now call YA. One of them was House of Stairs, which is about 5 kids in a Skinnerist experiment done by an evil totalitarian future United States. 2 boys and 3 girls. And the main character, who is male, has a crush on the other boy. And this is the main character, who is female, who would, in a normal YA, be the love interest, is just his buddy. And at some point, when they're at loggerheads with the other boy, for plot reasons, she's like, I know you've got this thing about him, but we've got to talk about it, right? And she lays it out. She doesn't say, you're gay or you're bi or whatever, but she does say that she acknowledges his crush and then says, we have to move past this and deal with this problem. And that was my first time having my expectations as a reader completely subverted in terms of gender and romance. Right. And then so that was when I was a kid. And then in college, I really got into I devoured every Michael Moorcock I could find.
Sure. Yeah.
And one of them was this 4-volume The Cornelius Chronicles. And unlike Elric and Coram and Hawkmoon, whatever, this was an explicitly bisexual protagonist. And there's one hilarious, I can't, it would take me too long to read it, but there's one, he does all sorts of experimental fiction stuff in the Cornelius Chronicles. But in the first book, I think it's in the final program, the first book, he has a page-long paragraph just listing all the people at a party. And he's got like the college students from here and whatever. It goes through that, and about 2/3 of the way through the list, it just says a heterosexual, and then just keeps going.
They invited them
I was like, wow. There's like gay sex in here, male. Not very explicit sex, but like explicitly, like these guys have just had sex and they're having pillow talk, kind of thing. And his Breakfast in the Ruins, the framing device is a homosexual encounter between 2 characters. And it's a bunch of stories, but that's the framing device. And so this was something I didn't know you could do, right? Until I was in college and figuring out my own sexual orientation at the same time. And I was like, wow, this was super cool. So, and it helped, actually. This helped, Mike's work helped me on that. So that was pretty cool. And then, I eventually found WisCon. I eventually found all the wonderful feminist queer literature that we've been talking about, A Different Light. I loved A Different Light. It was the first Elizabeth Lynn that I read. So moving on from our youth, all 3 of us eventually became writers. I'm been working on the short story level. You all have been working with stories and novels. And during that time, so now we're going to move forward into like the 80s and 90s and the 2000s. How has the genre's approach to queer fiction changed, and how have you changed in your writing, how you approach it and things like that? So I know it's a tiny topic, should take 5 minutes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, that to be fair, the 2000s was when I was first published.
Yeah.
So
we can talk about what you read in the 80s and 90s too, and how you.
Sure, we can talk about that. I think there was an explosion actually during that time of queer stuff. I remember reading like Poppy Z. Bright and just like I don't know. I'm Chris on the spot. I can't name all the things I was reading in the 80s and 90s, but I feel like there was just this weird little, very small beginning of a bubble of at least GLBT stuff, and less on the T at that time. Although I feel like John Varley was writing not great, but at least like, wasn't it Wizard or something that had a trans character, a guy who could get into a tube and change genders? And I say guy because I believe the character started out as male and then just flipped back and forth. But yeah, I mean, that was a time when I was reading a lot of different stuff and when I was finding a lot of stuff. How about you, Deborah? What did you find during the 80s, 90s?
Woo. Well, the 80s is, I started publishing short fiction in the early 80s,
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of my own work. I go completely blank, but I did make some notes and about when things came out. And the 80s, the late 80s, were the beginning of Misty Lackey's Valdemar series.
Oh God, of course, yes.
Yeah. So Arrows of the Queen was 1987, but Magic's Pawn, which was again a book that a lot of my gay friends cited, was in 1989.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, one of them made the comment that it didn't age well, so maybe not.
Well,
It
it's
had
important
the gays thing going
important
on.
at the time, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we just had
At the time it was really important. I'm going to go kind of sideways. This isn't really answering the question, but for a decade by decade summary of the starting with pre-1970, Catherine Lundoff, who
Yes.
is writes lesbian fiction and also runs Queen of Swords Press, wrote a series called Out of the Past, and it's on www.queersci-fi.com. And it's decade by decade. You could say, oh, this should have been included, but it's a really good place to start. I think the 70s were nibbles here and there, and you can point to this book or that book, or we came up with a few duplicating Theodore Sturgeon and Elizabeth Lynn, who was a little bit later. No, that's late 70s. But by the time we were in the 80s, there was indeed this explosion, not just in I'm not sure when the queer small presses really took off. I suspect it was around that time. Somebody from Lethe Press or Bella Books or something like that can probably take me to task for this. But in mainstream science fiction, so you see lots of titles from Tor and Daw and Ace, and that were aimed not at the specifically queer readers, but at general science fiction readers.
Right.
And I think once you get a sort of a critical mass of acceptability, it's like an avalanche. It keeps going that way.
Yeah, I'll point out of the final program, which I mentioned earlier, was originally published serially in 1965 and 66.
Wow.
And explicitly by a gender fluid protagonist. And he's an aspect of Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion, who's reincarnated. And one of the later books of the Hawkmoon series, he's reincarnated as a woman, Ilian of Garethorn. And so he's sometimes a she. And there's a woman called the Rose in some of his other fiction, who is another aspect of the Eternal Champion. So the Eternal Champion is not super gendered. Right?
I would love to explore a little bit more about why this happened in the 80s, because there's some interesting things that were happening in the 80s, including Anne Rice's interview with a vampire. Right?
Yeah, wasn't that like right at the end of the 70s or early?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right at the end of the 70s, early 80s. Yeah. I read it in the 80s, but
that was hugely. But that was like it's like homoerotic without sex, right? Because they do the instead.
they do make it queer family. It's very terrible, but I mean, there is Lestat and Louis make a very terrible with Claudia.
I
Terrible.
Yeah.
I never resonated with those books because I wanted to just slap Louis. Like,
yeah, like who doesn't? But but like I was thinking about that, and like it's just interesting to me that it was just as I think Deborah was talking about, like into like straights were reading this stuff, like the cis straights were reading this stuff, and there was a lot, and we can't forget the influence of Samuel Delaney on this time period.
Yeah, right.
And all sorts of people were writing stuff that right now I kind of feel like wouldn't get published. You know what I mean? Like there's this weird backlash that happens shortly after I get published where people start talking about how there was, you know, you have to re-educate people that there was a history, a really strong history of queer science fiction, even though we had this giant, what I felt like to me, a giant bubble during this time period where it was, I mean, even Buffy briefly experimented in the 90s with having a gay character on TV. We had, you know, we had Xena, and we had things that like, they did a lot of what we now call queer coding, right? But like it was all there, and it was there for consumption for everyone, including all the straights and the cis folks. So I don't know. I'd be curious as to what caused that. Do people, has anybody have a theory?
So there's market forces, right? And then there's cultural.
Why were we into queer things when in the 80s? I mean, other than for my personal needs, I don't think I drove the market.
Yeah, well,
it's all about you.
Like, you know, coming into adulthood and all that. So for me, it was perfectly timed. I will also point out that fan fiction is often very queer friendly, right? And it started science fiction, fan fiction. One of the earliest things was Slash, which was Kirk / Spock, romantic or erotic fiction, right? That started the Slash genre.
Yeah, girl, you don't have to explain Slash to me. I still
right. So I'm explaining it to our audience if they're not familiar.
But Star Trek, the original, was mid-60s.
Yeah.
So I think people wrote.
Slash was in the early 70s.
Was it? Yeah.
It was after the.
It wasn't too much later than that.
No.
So it had been established for a while by the 80s. I think the women's empowerment movement had a lot to do with that, because that was 70s.
Right.
Going into the 80s with that explosion of inclusiveness and joyful, joyful, let's go explore. But whenever you have a social movement like that, you have a backlash to it, as we are seeing now. And so I think that by the time we get into the 90s, yes, there were wonderful writers, but also you were starting to see that social backlash.
I will argue that with you, since I published in the late 90s and had a trans character that was very front and center in my book. And no one even blinked at Penguin when that was published. And also, but we have a comment from our little group here about how it started being, Cheryl Alexander says I mean, I'm presuming queer stuff in the public eye started being mainstream in a very weird way. And I do think that that's really true, because one of the things that I think was also happening that we kind of hit on with the marketing stuff is that a lot of straight people were writing queer stuff. And a lot of cis people were trying out trans and gender fluid things. And some of them did it well, and some of them did it badly. But like there was this space in this time period, like even George Alec Effinger writing his When Gravity Fails had trans characters in there. And the character had a kink, so it was weird. And one of the things I remember talking to Melissa Scott, who I consider a colleague, about when all of this stuff was happening, we were going back and forth about why so much gay in space. And what is particularly during the time when cyberpunk was very, she wrote Trouble in Her Friends, which was phenomenal. And, I was writing at the same time. And at any rate, we were talking about this, and we were talking about how one of the ways that the mainstream folks accepted us is because gay was considered sort of a thing you'd find in the underbelly of society, right? Like you'd go to the gay bars if you were edgy back in the 80s and 90s.
Sure. Yeah,
and so this was seen as the future is dark, so there are gay people in it, as an acceptable way for for straight folks to be like, okay, I guess if we're in a terrible dystopia, there will be gay people everywhere, you know, which I found really fascinating. I don't think it's entirely true, but I do think there's a little element to that in at least some of the places where you find, because that's cyberpunk folks really did very much embrace the idea that queer folks would be everywhere and all sorts of queerness.
Yeah, William Gibson in Count Zero has a lesbian couple at the beginning. Richard Kadri in Metrophage, the central characters are a polyamorous triad, 2 women and a man. Yeah,
that's a really early poly thing. I didn't know about that. That's cool.
Yeah. So that was the late 80s when Metrophage came out. And I want to say that there were queer characters in Pat Cadigan's, but I'm not.
Oh, there absolutely were.
Yeah.
I mean, if they weren't explicit, her whole Sinners stuff was very queer and
right.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That was in there. So there was also in a completely different thread. There was something Deborah, going off the thread Deborah said, the Wanderground by Sally Miller Gearhart was this all-women utopia thing from the late 1970s. So there was a female separatist utopia literary subgenre.
Yeah,
Right?
I have a bit of geekery about that book.
Good.
My sister did the illustrations for it. Yeah, my
Nice.
sister's Elizabeth
That's so
Ross,
cool.
the
I
artist.
don't think I read an illustrator. I had the Women's Press SF edition, which was a reprint, and I don't think that
Yeah,
was
the first edition had beautiful line
Nice.
drawings. Anyway, geekery, yes.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
You know, so there's that genre of all women societies, but even before that, like Philip Wiley, The Disappearance, and Lois McMaster, Bujold, Ethan of Athos, we have single sex societies. And there was something else that was related to Ethan of
And
Athos.
of course, the famous story When It Changed.
Yes, that's it. That's it. Right.
So,
Yeah. And the early ones, like I don't think Wiley even mentioned what did these two societies do for sex. But after that, it's like, first of all, recognizing that what are we, 10% of the population, but also that many people are fluid, that sexual orientation for many, not all, but for many, is a spectrum, and it depends on the personalities of the people involved, but it also depends on circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is I'm gonna actually cite some behavioral science about rats. So when I was an undergraduate, one of the psychology courses I took as a Common Core was taught by Martha McClintock, who had, previous to this, famously overturned decades of scientific literature about rat sex. And what she did was she looked at all of the experiments of the various animal behavioralists, and she said, all of the experiments you're describing rat sex in cages, in small cages. Why don't I build like a room-sized terrarium and observe? And she found it was completely different in the room-sized terrarium than it was in the cages. That the cage rat sex was a lot more like prison sex among humans. Than,
makes sense.
Yeah, and she published, and everyone went, "Oh." Right. So yeah, human sexuality. I mean, there's a lot. When you're in different spaces, human sexuality can be very different, right?
Makes sense. Yeah.
I'm gonna spin on something that I could be completely wrong about. But I noticed that Cheryl made a comment. I hung out in gay bars in the 70s. I'm not gay, but I liked being there. And I had the experience of not feeling safe in mixed gender bars, but feeling safe in gay bars and lesbian bars.
Mm-hmm.
And getting back to fanfic,
Mhm.
and I've been on panels on it, and one thing that comes up is, why does MM/ have such an appeal for adolescent girls?
And lesbians. Let's not lie. A lot of lesbians write MM.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and so my idea is because it's a safe way of exploring those feelings.
Yeah, I think so. And I also think it's one of the things about slash in particular, and male slash. And we've discussed this at length at some early Wisconsin panels, but I feel like there's also an ability to play with power dynamics in same-sex coupling that's different when it's binary. And because of the oppression of men and our, the way women have been oppressed in this society, I should say, by men, that it's hard to play, like for straight folks to play with the idea of, dubious consent, for instance, or some kink play feels different when it's straight folks than it does when it's queer folks. But I do think you're right. I think there's lots of ways for people to explore like all sorts of relationship dynamics that are different when you remove sort of what we sense as removing a lot of the cultural baggage that comes with being gay or straight, out of this, or straight, I should say, out of this. I was thinking about gay bars, but go ahead.
Yeah, because if you're bi, you can be in a straight mixed gender relationship or same gender relationship, whatever. So yeah, I think that does remove what is an automatic power dynamic, male female. And I'm not being gender absolutist, right? Like we would go out.
No, I don't mean to be either, and I do realize it sounds that way.
But that there is that power dynamic is always sort of hovering in the background, right? And so if you take that out of the equation, then there are different things you can do, right, in terms of relationships and sexuality and what have you. So I think that so why let's talk about alien sex, right? Like, why is it that a lot of people are more comfortable with human alien sex than they are with queer human sex, for example, right? It's true though, right? I mean, they're from the green girls in Star Trek to whatever. Spock is the result of an interspecies relationship, right?
Right.
And is the inspiration for tons and tons of Mary Sue stories.
Yeah.
Yes, true enough.
And let's face it, Han and Chewie have a bromance going there that, I mean, it's platonic maybe, but certainly a bromance.
I was talking with my family about sort of the history of queer characters in literature, and I said, is the Epic of Gilgamesh
It's totally
queer? Yeah, and we couldn't agree. And one family member insisted it was a bromance, and I said, that's so intense. It's so intense. But it's coding. I think it's coding. Just like
I think so too.
So another book that I read as a child, Jack Vance wrote a tetralogy that was apparently originally a treatment for a TV show, but it never got produced. So he released it as 4 novels. Shay, Planet of Adventure. And I have I bought as a kid the Daw paperback editions, which were like $1.95 each, right? I love that. And the third book, and each one of the books explored a different alien species on the planet Shay. And by the way, I know how to pronounce it because I asked Jack Vance how to pronounce the name of the planet. But the third book, The Dirter, is what he explicitly says. And like I was like maybe 13 or 14 reading this. What he explicitly says is the Dirter had something like, it's been a while, 18 different biological sexes, but they were only allowed, each a being of a particular sex was only allowed to have sex or form relationships with like a subset of the remaining ones, right? For whatever reason that was procreative, but there were social rules saying you could only have sex with the appropriate genders in your species. But what he said right after that was, and for this reason, the Durdur were very careful to hide their biological sex so that they could have sex with whoever they wanted. I'm just like, wow. That's like a whole society where like, yeah, you can't have queer sex, so we'll just hide our gender and have all the queer sex we want. And they had made that decision as a society, kind of. And I just loved that.
That reminds me of J.M. Fry's Triptych, where there's an alien who's basically stranded on Earth, and their family structure and sex structure is 3 people. And this poor alien finally hooks up with a human couple that's open-minded, and they form a family and a sexual unit. But the rest of human society goes batshit about it.
Right?
Yes.
In a similar vein, the Xenogenesis, aka Lilith's Brood trilogy by Octavia Butler. The aliens who have a very dodgy sense of consent form 3-way relationships, 2 humans and one of them as an intermediary who mixes the DNA and creates a new being, hence Xenogenesis. And she talks at length about like Nikanj is the alien in the middle of this, who inserts itself into the middle of a human male-female romantic relationship, and in a very coercive way, but at the same time, it's dark, right? Because humanity has basically wiped itself out with nuclear war. There are something like 40 humans left out of billions. Whoa. And the aliens, that's when the aliens arrive, and they scoop up the survivors and they say, well, we have implied consent because you had wiped yourselves out and were terminal. So yeah. Octavia was great at like screwing over every protagonist from the get-go. The setup was just horrible. That's a 3-gendered, 2-species kind of triad romantic situation, right? Because the characters do come to very much care for the alien in their triad, right? And so they make that accommodation, but then they kind of fall in love. So it's really, I mean, it's meant to be problematic, but it's also an interesting example of that. And then in her short story Bloodchild, which is also meant to be problematic, the aliens are like the botfly. She'd read about the botfly, and she decided the aliens reproduce kind of like the movie Alien, where like they insert things, but possible to extract the baby. Usually the human host survives, right? And so this human volunteers to do it because if they don't, they'll take the protagonist's sister, I think, and use her for it. So again, coercive aliens in a situation, but it's the Bloodchild is the kid that's born out of this this reproductive thing. So the species requires another species to, but they're sentient and technological, and so they try to use surgery to make the host survive, whereas in a state of nature the host would not survive. Right. So it's a really dark, but it's interesting, right? Because it's this kind of very different reproductive cycle of a sentient species, and also because Octavia, coercive and dark, right?
Yeah. But I do think that one of the Cheryl, who's been our very faithful commenter this whole time, has a really interesting answer that sort of, or a comment that leads to, I think, kind of the answer to your question. What Cheryl says is that Piers Anthony did a series of sex, aliens, and respective morals. And that's the thing that I think is really interesting, that last bit, is that I think one of the reasons, science fiction has the ability to play with, or what your question was more, Cliff, that why do we tolerate it? Queer stuff, with aliens more than we do with humans, is that with aliens, we can remove the sort of Puritan morals that a lot of Americans in particular, English speakers, have sort of, and we can just be like, well, those aliens, this is how they are built. And so we can do that a little bit more with more flexibility. I think that Cheryl kind of got into that by mentioning
science fiction and fantasy, but mostly I think science fiction is uniquely positioned to do an end round around prejudice, right?
Absolutely, right, exactly.
Like that famous Star Trek where the aliens were like divided and half white, half black.
Everyone hates that, but I loved that.
I think it's brilliant for the 1960s. That's a brilliant way of doing an end run around racism. The gut level reaction. Well, you look the same. Oh, come on, he's black on the right side. Can't you tell the difference? And then there's of course, Dax, right, and the Trill, and the gender swapping hosts. Right. And so you have gender fluid, like sentient space slugs that go inside their hosts. And anyway, so there was like lesbian was sort of explored. And I will credit Babylon 5 for having explicitly gay relationships as no big deal.
Yes.
That was huge in the 90s. When Star Trek was dancing around it with aliens, Babylon 5 was like, no, let's have, Ivanova's bi. Right? That's it. Right. She has a relationship with Talia. She has a relationship with Marcus. Done. And then there's the cover story for Marcus. And this was in the 90s. The cover story for Marcus and Dr. Franklin, Stephen Franklin, when they were going undercover to Mars, was that they were a married couple.
Yeah, I loved that.
It was no big deal. And the humor was not based on any kind of let's make fun of a married gay couple. It's like, let's just make fun of being a couple because we're not obviously romantic. Yeah. And Marcus just keeps needling him because like he's making fun of being in a romantic relationship, but it has nothing to do with the genders.
Right.
And so that was huge on at least that was huge to me to see that representation, right? There was another book that I wanted to talk about, but it flew out of my mind. I will hopefully remember before the end. But another 1970s queer book. There were lots.
There were a surprising number.
So let's, it's getting towards we're 2/3 of the way through. So let's talk about your writing and what kind of, how you decided to write. I want to hear about collaborators from Deborah, but I also want to hear about all the queer stuff that Lyda has written. So talk about your writing and how you feel like how you were inspired and how you feel like you're contributing to the conversation.
I cede the floor to Deborah to start this.
Okay. Well, as I said, I started selling short fiction in the early 80s. And I sold a lot of short stories before I sold my first novel. And there were queer characters and there were polyamorous relationships in some of those stories. And my second published novel, Northlight, had an FF couple. It is, both of them are bi, and both of them are so wounded at the beginning of their relationship that this is the only healing, intimate relationship either one of them can have. And actually, that is what drives the plot for most of it. And then in 1991, I lived in, my family and I lived in Lyon, France, which was the center of the French resistance to the Nazi occupation. Oh my God, it was amazing. my kids were 4 and 11, and they both went to school, the older one in a bilingual school, but it was just an amazing experience. Anyway, every time you turned around, you either saw a Roman ruin or a plaque that said, at this date in 1940 something, so many Jewish families were deported, or so many people were executed by the Gestapo. I mean, every time you turned around, it was there. So I got interested in all of the different ways that people either resisted or collaborated with the German occupiers, because it is very, very complex, and it wasn't all Germans are bad, we will resist, but it happened sequentially and for many, many different reasons, everything from financial opportunism to deeply held religious beliefs and everything in between. So, okay, story. But I'm a science fiction writer, so occupation and resistance on an alien planet. It's about power. All of this is about power. Who has it, who wants it, how people get it. In order to talk about power, you have to talk about gender. So remember, this is 1991 that I'm thinking this. And so I decided the way to highlight that was to make the alien race gender fluid and to set up one misunderstanding after another. Some of them are political and social, but a lot of them are based on gender politics and power structures. And so that's collaborators. The first edition, I was using my then married name, which went bye-bye forever with much celebration. So when I got the rights back, I brought it out under my actual name, which I'm never changing again. And it was a finalist for the Nebula Award. I used the masculine pronoun as inclusive for the native race, probably because it was I was formulating this in the very early 90s, right. And I hadn't had those discussions about pronouns and gender identity and how the aliens might see themselves. Today, I might make a different choice. But that's what I did then. And on the very first page, there's a discussion. There's a native with two of his children are out stargazing, and they see the Earth spaceship in orbit. And he makes an offhand comment that one of the children he had born himself, but the other had been born by his dead maid, and was especially precious to him. And it just, my heart went out when the scene came to me. And I remember reading it, I think it was SF and SF. I read the opening, and Nisi Shaw was in the audience, and she said, "Wow, you really nailed it. We are not in Kansas, and we are with families love each other." And that's actually one of the verses in the book. So
it is very family focused.
It's very family focused, yeah, because the aliens are, and they have their relationships and their biology have humans constantly confused because of their androgynous, slightly masculine appearance in the neutral state. And then when they get pregnant, they look very, very female. And the humans just don't know how to cope with that. And sometimes they misunderstand with disastrous consequences. So, and since then, so I wrote that book in the mid 90s. It didn't get published in 2013, but in the meanwhile, I started continuing Marion Zimmer Bradley's Darkover series. And of course, there are queer characters there. Not so much trans, but yeah, some cherry. So I take that back, yes. And one of the things that I got to do in the last year of Marion's life, she wrote a novel that was mostly about Regis and Danilo. And I waited a few books before I could tackle it. She was very, very ill at the time. She'd had all these strokes, and finally, Betsy Walheim entrusted me with this manuscript, and I went, "There's the heart of a really good story here, but oh my goodness, I cannot use any of this prose." And so a lot of it was how they dealt with a polyamorous situation, because Regis does get married. And it raises all kinds of issues because his primary relationship is with his male lover. And for reasons, he gets married to an unusually open-minded woman who understands the situation and doesn't try to change it. And the interesting thing is, yeah, I got email from gays who were still in the closet thanking me. I got email from a lesbian who used the book as a way of coming out to her father. And I got hate mail saying, "How dare you put homosexuals on Darkover?"
No one is queer on Darkover.
No one, possibly. Yes. The Darkover series is coming to an end with this next book, and I'm one of the projects that I want to move forward with, which is in almost finished form, is features it's YA. My character is lesbian teenager astronomy geek, saves the world from chaos vampires, kind of thing. And
As one does.
As one does, absolutely, absolutely. Especially since the chaos vampire is female and uses pheromones to get the males to do whatever she wants until she encounters a lesbian, and then interesting things happen.
Nice, I like it.
In the future, there's more queer stuff coming down the turnpike.
Okay, Lyda, you're doing all sorts of camera shenanigans. Oh, I can't hear you. So your sound went off. Talk, say something. Nope. All right, so while Lyda is figuring out your microphone issue, which is keep trying to talk because we can't hear you. I'll say that I have, like I said, I've only published short stories so far. I do have one novelette in a Baen anthology straight out of Deadwood of weird westerns, where I have an explicitly bi, lesbian-leaning protagonist. And the plot is driven by, hopefully Bob will be able to get her back on. The plot is driven by a past relationship she has had with a married woman, and the jealous husband is a wizard and has been sending monster after her.
Ooh, yeah. I remember you telling me about that.
Yeah, and so that, and interestingly enough, I read one reader review of the anthology, and this reader said that my protagonist had a relationship with the wizard, and he had sent, this monster. And I'm like, how did you miss that? Because I was very explicit about, no, he was having a relationship with the wizard's wife, or she was having a relationship with the wizard's wife. And, she has to actually explain that to a kid in the 1880s. And so, and she said, well, don't covet your neighbor's wife. That was what I, fell into, because the kid is a child of a preacher, so understands that. Okay, Lyda is saying that she cannot unmute. But we are at this point 6 minutes away from the end of the hour, so I'm going to ask Lyda to type things or to do interpretive dance. Bob,
I want to see Lyda do interpretive dance.
Well, at this point, we're about 5 minutes from the end, so this is the point where Bob is going to plug some B-Cubed Press titles, and then I'm going to ask my guests to plug their latest works, and at the very least, Lyda can hold up a book cover. So, Bob, take it away.
Hey, Lyda, can you hear me? I didn't ask if you could talk. I just said, could you hear? Uh-oh.
We just lost Deborah. Okay, Bob, why don't you tell us about B-Cube Press titles?
Okay, well, yeah, I just was going to suggest to Lyda that if she will type in something about her book that she would like to say, we can copy it over and paste it in the comments so it can get to the folks. And I'll let you take care of doing that.
Yep.
And I don't know if Deborah is gone or just taking. Oh, there she is.
Yay.
Good. Well, anyway, hi, this is Bob Brown, BQ Press. I am here to plug. First of all, I'll tell you next week is David Gerald and Jim Wright. And I found out the hard way. They will not let me vanish off like I did this time. So I'm going to be hanging with them. And I'm also going to be doing that from Black Hills Con. Now, it's a wonderful little anime convention where you can, if you are into anime, you will love it. And if you're not into anime, you probably will love it anyway, because I found out that anime cons are like writing cons and are like gaming cons. That might be just the lead track, but there's a whole lot of everything else going on. And so it's going to be fun. And we'll be doing that from there next week. I'm down in Texas right now, just finished up with a book signing at my high school, Alma Mater. And there you go, Cliff. Get that copied over.
Okay.
And now what BQ Press has got going, our most recent releases were the holiday series. And, it's kind of past that. But let me just say that we do have some new books coming in process. We just finally closed out Scott's Planet. So we're going to start editing. And I understand, Cliff, you submitted for that. Good. I hope that it doesn't suck so I can buy it.
Me too.
Hey, we all have our standards. If it doesn't suck, I try to give serious thought to it.
Yeah, well, Andy said it didn't suck. So, hey, he's not the editor, though.
You want to bet?
Bob, I don't know how to paste it into the regular chat. I don't know.
Okay. Then I'll do that
okay.
In a second.
But anyway, yeah. So keep going. You got other open things, though.
Yeah, and we got some openings out there. You said there's a thing that Deborah Godfrey and I are, Jeff, an Australian fellow whose name I can't remember, and I are editing Scott's Planet. That's where you have 1,300 people who got talked into migrating to a planet when the corporation that talked them into it said, we're done. We're going home. Have a nice future, stranded colonists. We're enjoying that one. The other one we have, that's closed, so no good.
But there will be future volumes in that series.
There will be future volumes. The next one we have right now, it is Karen G. Anderson. Karen G. Anderson is one of the most best up-and-coming writers I've ever had a chance to work with. She is a marvel on writing. She's pretty damn organized, and she's a nice person. And so she is editing, going back to the very first book we published. Okay. I know she's still there somewhere. To the very first book we published is Alternative Truths. And so this one is Alternative Truths, Southern Edition, Bless Their Hearts.
Is that part of the title?
That is the title.
Bless Their Hearts is part
of
it.
Beautiful title.
Hey, come on. Was Sarah Huckabee trying to make it up so a 14-year-old girl can serve you drinks in a bar? Um, and, oh, we can't get enough workers. Let's drive the wage down a little bit more by putting high school kids working at night. And it's
Yeah.
just horrible what they're doing. And the, Disney and God, DeSantis down there. DeSantis saying,
don't mess with the mouse.
yeah, I hope he learns that the hard way. But DeSantis making it so that if teacher can get fired for revealing their sexual orientation to their students, come on, guys, this is ridiculous. Let's let the world be. And so it's just across the South. You go into Texas where there's a bounty on pregnant girls. If you can find a pregnant girl that you can prove is pregnant and doesn't deliver, you get a $50,000. I'm about done with conservatives, and don't get me going on the gun problem.
Yep.
I had a nice conservative person telling me she said, well, guns aren't the problem. I said, look, when little Johnny's dad gets depressed and shoots himself in the head, that's a problem. That's a gun problem. She said, no, that's not a gun problem. That's the little Johnny's problem. I was about done at that point. My response wasn't pretty.
Yeah.
So, yeah, let me just say that we write a little bit on the social liberal side, and here's a couple of books that are going there. Then the other one we got an open call for right now is alternative leadership. And what we're talking about is leadership roles. Okay. For many people in the science fiction community, the first time a woman showed up as president of SFWA, it was the end of the world, and because that person didn't know their place. They were in a role that wasn't made for them. Hello, Lyda. And so this is a book about people being in alternative roles and how they get there and how do they manage it. How well do they do? I mean, do you really think the National Organization for Women is ready for a gay president? Or, a male leader? Is the National Football League going to get a... Hey, we're bouncing everywhere.
Just keep talking.
Yeah, that's the concept. So these are available to submit to on Moksha, and we're excited to do it. And again, next week we've got Jim and David. So that's what B Cube Press is up to. And so why don't you have our guests tell you what they're up to?
Bob's going to type in or paste in Lyda's into the conversation, and I'll read.
No, I'm not going to type it in. I'm going to cut and paste it.
For those watching later, Lyda writes, my book will be called Welcome to Boynet, the first of the Earth Shadow series, and will be coming out from Wizard Tower Press in the fall of this year. Yeah, and I can't wait to see that in print because I've been reading it as a serial novel in our critique group, and it's just it's going to be awesome. You're going to love it. People are going to love this book. The working title for that book, by the way, was Lesbians in Space. It has to be said that way. Okay, Deborah, and then I'll go.
My most recent is the penultimate Darkover novel, Lair and Gambit. Yay. Marion's name is on it because it's in Darkover, but I wrote it. I'm working on a novella, which is basically Red Sonja in the Land That Time Forgot. Swords of dinosaurs with a lot of parent-child interactions.
What's not to like?
What's not to like? Yeah, it's okay. Don't have to go into that.
So on Tuesday, are you done? Sorry.
And also Penumbra, the queer YA against chaos vampires that I mentioned, and I don't have a publication date for that. Just stay tuned. The novella is Many Teeth, and I'm almost done with it.
Yay.
Anyway.
All right, so I've got a story out in, in Many Worlds Anthology, which is a shared world. And that just came out on Tuesday. And I don't have a physical copy yet. I don't have my contributor's copy yet, but that came out on Tuesday. And I'll plug next month's third Sunday, where I will be talking about shared worlds with Bob. And also the two guests, Cadwell Turnbull, who created the Many Worlds Shared World, and Kevin Andrew Murphy, who is a member of the collective for Wildcards, created by George R. R. Martin. So that is in 1 month, on the third Sunday of July. So, and the other thing is, I remember the other book I wanted to mention, because I didn't want to escape without mentioning the Titan Wizard and Demon series by John Varley. Because Titan came out in the late 70s and had a lesbian relationship in the heart of it, and some other alternative sexualities, including aliens and all sorts of stuff. And that was a science fiction book club, I think, alternate selection. So I got that in the mail with like my Isaac Asimov and everything, and it blew my mind as I was like, a kid, a teenager. While Cheryl writes a couple of other things that some Southerners are cool. In fact, most Southerners are cool. I
bless their hearts.
Yes, right. I'm from many places, but mostly identify as from Memphis, Tennessee. So I like to think that I'm not a jerk. And Cheryl says she hasn't heard about Wildcards in a long time. I know it's been optioned for TV, so that I don't know whether that's going into pre-production or production, or how the writer's strike is or isn't affecting that. But so you might, depending on the television thing that may or may not happen, you might or might not be hearing about Wildcards. But I'm sure Kevin will tell us whatever he is allowed to tell us with regard to any NDAs that might be in effect. About that. So that's it for this week's Speak Cubed Sunday morning. And
almost the end. I had one more thing to add.
All right.
And that's a call out to my daughter, Cheyenne Brown. She bless her heart, is in her 30s, and she wrote a 4-page spread for a magazine in the Tri-Cities called Tumble Weird, instead of Tumbleweed, Tumble Weird.
I like it already.
On diving into the salty waters of late life lesbianism. And while I just had to appreciate the title, it was like, hon, you ain't met late life yet, but I'm glad you're able to try and get out there with it. But so it's very good to see that she's finding her pen as well, because there's one thing I will tell you every time, and this is for the folks out there who say, well, I can't hang a pride flag from my house or this or that. When you hang that pride flag from your house, you're telling that neighbor, that person down the street, somebody else, that they're not alone. Okay? And that's sometimes when you're dealing with the people who've been treated poorly, or classes of people that have been treated poorly. You can't change the world always, but you can do things to let individuals in that group know that not everybody hates them, and that there are other people either like them or who are not afraid of them, not offended by them. So this Pride Month, I urge you, get out there and let the world know that I guess the easiest way to say it is being gay is okay. It's not something you can know. And that I just thought I'd add that in because that's it's the same time if you're going to stand by the side of the road with a sign that said "Stop killing our kids in school." You're letting other people in the world who think that know that they believe that they're not alone too. So that said, I will thank you all for being here, and um, the Jewish God is non-binary. Well,
Yeah, Lyda was talking about how she said she wasn't able to talk about her non-binary God, and I was pointing out that the Jewish God that has male and female aspects, like Shekinah is a female aspect, and if you study Kabbalah, there's
you know what, Lyda,
5 female. Anyway,
we'll get you once we get our claws into it. We like to go get you, bring you back, and the ladies. And I don't mean to make this a diminishing the doors that do the Sunday brunch. I will make sure that they know that your guys are willing, and so that they bring you back too. But we don't.
That's
we try not
G. Anderson,
female guests for that.
Please do.
But we'll see
Please
you,
do.
and you guys take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
It's been a joy. Love is a great thing. Let's celebrate all its